everyone. We'll start with our second session of the day on non-emergency numbers. I'm very pleased to chair this session. I'm Fabrice Dami, Medical Director of the Dispatch Center in Lausanne. Yesterday, one of our colleagues from Israel said that on purpose, he said that they would not create a non-emergency number in their country, but hopefully maybe we have people here that will tell you that maybe we should have one. So first speaker, Benoit Vivier, I don't need to present him. He is a Public Affairs Manager of EENA, and Benoit, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, or hello again to those who have I seen today. So I just want to give a short update on what's the situation of non-emergency numbers in Europe. And you might remember that this summer I might have annoyed you. Sorry, I will remove my mask. We'll try, at least. I'll do like that otherwise. So yeah, this summer I sent you, to most of you, an email asking what's the situation of non-emergency numbers in your country. And so based on your responses, so thank you for that, I could prepare a short overview to kind of introduce that session. So I tried first to define what a non-emergency number is, and it's actually very difficult, and I couldn't find any definition anywhere, so I tried to give my own. So it's a number that we can dial to require help from an emergency service, but for a situation that is as such non-urgent. So for instance, any information on what is happening, any advice, sometimes some availabilities in hospitals, for instance, etc. We'll see that later. And usually it's part of the PSAP's objective to better communicate with the people and also to offer better service and, of course, to sort the urgent matters and the non-urgent matters. So it can really help the PSAPs to really get just the urgent part and then leave the non-urgent requests to other services. A question, should it be a short number or not to be defined as a non-emergency number? And of course, there's everything that goes with it. Should it be free of charge? Should it be accessible for roamers, etc.? There's many things we can discuss on what a non-emergency number is. And so I tried to map a bit what we have in terms of non-emergency numbers. And in most countries, like most of the non-emergency numbers, are actually for medical matters. And when we think of a non-emergency number for medical matters, you might remember that in Europe we have the 116, 117 number that is dedicated to medical matters, and it's available in a few countries. I listed only 4, maybe there's a bit more, but I could find for 4. But actually then there's other countries that have other numbers. You can see that most of them have short numbers. Sometimes you have a bit of a longer number. And yeah, that is what I could find for medical numbers. But you don't only have non-emergency numbers for medical matters, you also have for police matters, usually a short number as well. And you might also have sometimes some general crisis numbers that are available in a few countries or a few regions. Sometimes they're available only when there's some crisis happening. So you see different practices around the non-emergency numbers. And if we try to list and to add to that other non-emergency numbers, we know that in Europe there's the so-called 116 numbers. So it's reserved numbers that can be assigned by national regulatory authorities in telecommunications. And those are already kind of standardized or defined, and then it's up to the national authorities to assign them in their country. So those that are common to many countries are the 116000 for missing children. We have one for victims support, one for the child helpline, and some for the psychological support, which doesn't prevent the countries also to have their own numbers, which differs from this one, but at least those are existing in many different European countries. Of course, there are other kind of non-emergency numbers that exist or that are available. We have, I think, in maybe all the countries, there was some COVID-19 helpline that was implemented to get many kind of different information. We have also some numbers for fire advices, also helpline related to fire. Sometimes you see that a lot in the Baltic countries, in Lithuania, in Estonia, some general information number that you can call for any kind of information. Also some numbers for intoxications, for gas electricity issues, for domestic violence. So there's really different kinds of non-emergency numbers that exist. And also the management of such numbers is quite different. Sometimes it's managed directly by the PSAP. then it would be like in a separated room or separated call takers who can just like help to get some non-emergency requests from the overall flow of calls that is coming to the PSAP. Sometimes, and actually in most of cases, it's handled by the same authority that handles the emergency calls, but in a different PSAP. That's the case in the Netherlands, for instance, or in other countries. Yeah, you also have sometimes some kind of foundations. You have some partnerships that are done with foundations. Also with like local authorities, it can be done, or other public organizations. Yeah, there's many possibilities. It's also possible to delegate that service to a private organization. So you do some kind of agreements between the public authorities and the private organization that they would take care of those non-urgent requests. And also directly when it's about, for instance, the gas leak, for instance, the numbers for that, usually it would be the gas provider that would take care of these lines. So you see that there's really different types of organization that manage such requests. Also, you can see that depending on the countries, the communication can come with a cost or not. This is not harmonized. You see when it's like that sometimes it's some numbers that come with a cost, some don't, so it's like half free, half to pay. And also for the roamers, it's an issue. And actually, I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of countries because the information is actually very hard to find. And I can bet that in your country, you won't necessarily know whether the non-emergency numbers are available for roamers or not. But you can see that there's like different possibilities. Some additional considerations to end my presentation. So one is about the regional availability. Sometimes you have numbers that exist only in a few regions of the country, not everywhere, because usually those helplines are managed like regionally. The time availability, because you see, especially with the medical helplines, that they're open either during working hours, depending on which services takes care of it, but sometimes it's available only in the weekends, for instance. That's the case in Belgium, or when the general practitioners are not working. Some numbers are reachable from abroad. So for instance, I can contact the medical helpline of Copenhagen from here. And also for another consideration is the accessibility by other means. Usually, especially with the medical helplines, it goes with an app, for instance, that you can use, or some information on a website, for instance. And that is it for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Benoit. Are there any questions for him in the room about this short resume about the situation on non-emergency number in Europe? No, not yet. Okay, maybe later. Now I'm pleased to introduce Björn Skoglund. He's an operations specialist on 112 and crisis management from Sweden. Björn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Complicated. I'll go like this. Hi, I'm Björn, SOS Alarm, Sweden. I'm going to give a brief overview of the situation in Sweden when it comes to non-emergency numbers. And the outcome is how it can help the emergency services, and it can reduce number of calls to the 112 emergency number. So if you were looking for an answer to that, you can go to sleep now and miss the rest of the presentation. But I hope we will stay focused. Some words about SOS Alarm. We are the PSAP organization in Sweden, actually a company, but we are owned by the Swedish state, municipalities and regions. We handle about 3.5 million 112 calls every year. We have done this since 1974. We also do some other tasks like the hotline for missing children, and one of the numbers, non-emergency numbers. I will come back to that. And actually we have three non-emergency numbers, sorry. We have 1177, it's for health medical care, if you want some advice, be directed to where to go to if you feel sick. We have the national information number, 11313. When you want information about serious accidents or crisis, and the 11414 police non-emergency number. We also have one website. I will mention that briefly later on. I will not talk about the 116 series, which we also have in Sweden, of course. But first, why non-emergency numbers? We were very proud to have introduced and established a non-emergency number like 1177 and 11313 before the COVID crisis occurred, because this was established numbers, so we didn't have to communicate. Well, we do have to communicate about the numbers, but not from the beginning. We were starting from quite a high level. It has unburdened the emergency number, and I will come back to how they actually unburdened each other, some of these numbers. It's good to have one specific number for one specific sector and one appointed entity, not necessarily an authority, but an entity to run the number, responsible for the number. And this means also you can have a consistent and structured and uniform handling of that number and of the information. And I mean, we have heard a lot of talks about fake news during the COVID crisis, and this is a way of avoiding fake news if you have established numbers where you can trust on the information given. And I mean, this actually is a way to be redundant. I call it NEAPS, that's my own abbreviation, non-emergency access point. NEAPS can help each other within that sector. The Swedish situation before we introduced the 11414 for the police and the 1177 for medical emergency services was this. We have 21 regions, and each region has had their own number to the police or to the medical advice care. So when we introduced, I mean, it was, as you understand, it is quite easy to have one number. You have one number to remember. If you are in the northern of Sweden and going to the south of Sweden, you don't have to look up what number to call. It's the same number in all of Sweden. I will go to each of these numbers and start with the 1177, the healthcare guide 1177. This is a joint services for the 21 regions in Sweden, and it's staffed by registered staff nurses answering to all calls about, well, if you feel sick in any kind, it's not an emergency, but you have questions around it, where to go, is it dangerous, where can I find my journal, and so on. And they can find their journal on the web, 1177.se. It started in November 2013. This is when all the regions came together under one number. And this means that the regional centers can cooperate, and also that they have a national availability to sign interpretation or language interpretation, which of course is a big advantage. And they answered 3.9 million calls during 2019. I don't actually have a number for 2020, and I suppose that is quite higher. We have the non-emergency number to the police, 11414, and this was introduced in 2005, and the police had identified the need of having one number instead of 21, and you can see, I mean, the fragmented service, many numbers to different police stations and departments and so on. It was hard to find the right person to talk to at the police, and there was long queues waiting for an answer. So the 11414 is actually the switchboard number to the police, but you can also do, if you have to file a police report or give some info, not emergency, of course, but non-emergency info, you can dial this number. They have reached a certain degree of automation, and that is quite interesting. You can you can get a voice message where you can be directed to who to speak to. You can get an SMS back with a link if you want to file a police report online and so on. And they also had around 3.9 million calls in 2019. And the third number, not the least, is the number that SOS Alarm is responsible for, the 11313. It's a national number for information about serious accidents or crises. And you can actually both get information and leave information if you have vital information to authority. Before, we actually had information numbers temporarily set up for some diseases. You remember the swine flu, the bird flu, and the blue tongue disease that affected cows and so on. But as always, as I said, it's hard to introduce a number during a crisis, so better to have it set up before. And that is why we have the 11313 number since 2013. It's in the agreement we have with the Swedish state. I mean, the number is run by the Swedish state. We do it on agreement with them. It says that it has to be in close proximity with 112. We should be able to give information if someone calls and worries about fire trucks going to a place nearby. What is it? Do you know about it? Do I have to call 112? So we can ease them on that point. And of course, public warning. If they want to have more information about an issued public warning, they can get it on this number. As I said, you can leave information, and this means that we can deliver information to the authorities. We can give them information about questions that don't have an answer on, for example, the Public Health Authority's website. If there's a question that will be repeated over and over again, and the answer is not there, we can tell them, the authority, that you have to publish an answer to this. And we can also see trends, if something going up and down, some area of questions. Normally we have around 30-40 calls a day. I mean, there's not a crisis every day, but we learned during the COVID crisis that there's actually not any roof for how many calls there could be. We landed in about 2,000 calls a day, and at most we had 35,000 calls a day, so it was quite a race. I mean, in 2019 we had around 10,000 calls the whole year. In 2020 we had 688,000 calls, so it was an increase with almost 7,000%. And of course, a challenge to meet that call level. Just one picture about the Swedish site, crisisinformation.se. This is actually a good site because it doesn't produce its own information. It gives a small article about something and refers to the authorities' website. So here you can find this is the start page, so to say. If you don't know where to find information about a crisis, you can find it on this site. And we have used it a lot during the crisis to refer people to this website where they can find more information. Some words about the common features for this number and challenges or more recommendations maybe. But one challenge is of course that we have borders of action, borders of task for these numbers. And when you look at it, it might look at, oh, it's easy to define that 1177 it's about healthcare advice and 114 about police matters and so on. But when you look at closer, there are actually overlapping each other in more than one way. We learned during the COVID crisis that, I mean, the general questions about COVID is not only that I have symptoms, what to do, which is of course is a matter for 1177, but it can also be where can I get my vaccination, and that is where 11313 could unburden the important health care advice number. We could give them the general information, and 1177 could give the medical information. And we also, I took an example we had a lorry attack, a man driving down a street in central Stockholm with a lorry and killing 5 people in 2017. And people were, of course, that were in the central of Stockholm were very worried and tried to call 11313 or 11414. And this was not a good case for either of these numbers, because we referred to each other. People who called 113, 113 got the advice, you can call 114, it's a police matter. And when they called 114, 114, the police said, we don't know actually. I think you can call the number for information, 11313. And that was not a good situation. We have tried to manage that since then. COVID-19, yeah, we did get affected. Not as much the non-emergency number to the police, of course, since it was not a clear police matter, but they got actually 1 or 2 calls a day about COVID. 1177 had a large increase of calls, and that is why they actually started to a voice touch tone dialing that said press 9 if you want if you have general questions around COVID, and then the caller was transferred to 11313. And that meant, as I said, we had an enormous increase of calls to 11313, and we had to start hiring people, getting computers and so on in a very quick way to handle this. But it was important to unburden the 1177 number, of course, so that they could give very important advice on COVID and symptoms. We also started joint cooperation forums between the numbers. We quite early saw that we have to communicate with each other. We have to talk about things that we have in common. And we also had some authorities in these forums, so we could give the authorities direct feedback in these meetings. And this was also a very, very lucky thing to do. The positive thing about COVID is maybe the communication, where you could see that this is before COVID crisis, and the knowledge of the number were quite rapidly increased during 1 year. We will do this again in 2021, and I suppose that we will get a higher number also this year. And finally, some recommendations. You should have non-emergency numbers. That's the first recommendation, actually. And there should be a clear purpose for them. I don't think that you should have 10 non-emergency numbers. You had to, we think that 3 is quite enough for us. Define borders for the operation, but you must also be aware that there will nowhere be clearly defined as you want them. There will always be overlaps between the numbers. Keep close contact with the other numbers and communicate with the public around them. I mean, people do tend to forget them if there's not actual events going on. And remember, of course, that the crisis is often unexpected, so be prepared, and especially be prepared to upscale. The numbers of calls can rapidly increase, as we saw from one day to another. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Björn. Is there one question from the audience before we go forward? Yes, Mike for the first row.
Hi, Björn. Marike from the Netherlands. If I understand correctly, SOS Alarm is answering 112 and the 11313?
Well,
and the other one, you don't?
We are responsible for the number, but we actually have a subsidiary company to SOS Alarm.
Oh yeah, that was one.
So it's a call center actually that we use. So it's not the same operators, call takers, handling 112 that is handling 11313, which is important, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
I have one last question.
Yeah.
What is the rate of calls arriving in the non-emergency medical number, which are emergency? Because that was a fear we heard yesterday from the colleague from Israel. You know, it's a 5%, 10%, 20%?
I think the number of calls to the 1177 is around, I think, 1,000 to 2,000 a day. But during the COVID crisis, as I understand it, it was like 5,000 a day until they did this connection to 11313. We unburdened them with like 1,000 to 2,000 a day. So they were able to manage their task.
But how many emergency question on medical advice you have to transfer to 112?
Aha.
What is this rate?
Actually, not many now. It's maybe 1%, I don't know, something like that.
That's a very important point, and we have the same experience about 1 or 2%.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'll leave the floor to our next speaker, Luca Bergonzi, sales executive at Beta AT. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. Before we begin, I would like to ask a question to you. Can you please raise your hand if you are already involved in 116, 117 kind of business? How many of you are currently working on it or planning to work in such field? One in the audience? Oh, two, okay, thank you. Okay, right. So we are talking about the Italian experience with non-emergency numbers today, and then we will drill down a particular case that we are following as a technical provider. So let's say Italy is going through a reform of the non-emergency number, moving from the old traditional toll-free numbers to one specific number similar to what happened with Sweden. We all know about the European directive about 112, no, the 112 directive. Some of us, I personally didn't before starting this project, about the decision of the European Commission talking about the 116 asterisk numbers, which are supposed to be European harmonized number for with social value, no, in general. So we have seen 116000 for children help and so on. So Italy decided to actually apply the what we've seen before, creating the 116, 117 toll-free healthcare non-emergency number. How does it work? So what's the process that has been decided? It's very similar to 112, as a matter of fact. There is a person calling 116, 117 for medical aid. There is a call taker that qualifies the requests according to a procedure that was defined, so they actually follow a standard operation procedure, and according to the type of results that this procedure gives, they will forward the call to a doctor specifically who can handle the case. For example, also pediatric help is available and these kind of things. The primary reason why this was adopted is because the whole project was called primary healthcare model, aimed to relieve the stress from hospitals. There are a lot of people that are usually requesting help from hospitals, emergency room and so on, even if it's not necessary. So in order to avoid this huge flow of people, the 116, 117 number is supposed to be the first endpoint for people needing non-emergency medical aid and relieving the activity from the hospitals. Which kind of population is the number addressed to? So we have normal, healthy citizens, so people without any particular problem that are just looking for, let's say, education and promotion of programs. So typically, in this case, vaccination information during COVID and similar things. We have pre-diagnosed citizens that actually turn, like I said before, improperly to emergency services, hospitals and so on. They can actually get correct information from 116, 117 and do not overburden the emergency services dedicated to a particular case. We have chronic patients that are supposed to be treated on a daily basis or weekly basis and so on. So 116, 117 can also keep track of what's going on and be in touch with these people. And finally, patients with special needs or not self-sufficient, so home care, telemedicine, and so on. So this is the project. No? This is the project where we intend to go to on a national level. As a matter of fact, the idea of this primary healthcare model is not just to say, you call this number and you ask for information and that's it. Or you can talk to a doctor and that's it. But the idea is to create a huge network of services running around 116, 117. From the picture, you can see services like, the classical doctor, but information about the nearest pharmacies, information about where are the laboratories where you can take examinations. You can call 116, 117 to change your family doctor, and so on. So the structure is really going towards a complex network of non-emergency healthcare services. The investment plan for the period of 22-26 is about 4 billion euros for the whole country. Do not forget that Italy is a country of 60 million people, so the range of investments for these services, when you want to go nationwide, is always of a certain proportion. Anyway, since healthcare in Italy is managed regionally, and this is not going to change, I think, in the next few years, all these projects will be potentially regional based with interoperability, but still budgets and everything else will be found on a regional basis. In particular, now we will switch from national to local. So we have been providing the infrastructure and technology to Areo. Some of you may know Areo because they are the Lombardy managers of 112 as well as ambulance PSAP. Therefore, it was natural for them also to include the 116, 117 service that works very tightly with 112 and ambulance services. A few numbers about Areo. So since 2019, they established the 116, 117 service, not only for the basic data. So it's not only call taker plus doctor answering. They also give tourist medical services. So if you are, for example, visiting Italy and so on, you can refer to 116, 117 to get particular information. They also organize inter-hospital transportations, like I said before, critical patients, and the selection and change of family doctors. So they are already one step ahead in the process that we've seen before. Numbers about Areo, so you more or less have an idea of how big the organization is. Lombardy has 10 million citizens, which means it's a region, but still the size of an average European country. There are 38 call takers and workplaces, plus other 14 for particularly, let's say, complicated periods. They are all civilians using a question-based triage filter. Like I said, very similar to the concept of the 112 call-taking PSAP. Areo hires the call takers. They are responsible for the PSAP setup and maintenance, so whatever is about technology, shift planning, and everything else. They provide space and technology, so not only to the call takers, but also to the doctors. So Areo takes care of the infrastructure, the call center, but also provides remote technology to doctors that have to be connected with the whole infrastructure. But they do not hire doctors. So doctors are typically from hospital or from other healthcare structures. And they cooperate with local healthcare authorities to train these people. So not to train the call takers, of course they take care of that, but to train the out-of-hour doctors to perform correctly throughout the chain of actions in the 116, 117 operations. There is about 2,000.5, 3,000 calls per day in this contact center. And just as a comparison, the 112 equivalent handles averagely 12,000 calls per day. So similar to what happens in Sweden, of course, the quantity of calls for non-emergency is much lower. Now, let's stop talking, and I know a lot of you want to see data. So I brought some statistics and some data about 116, 117. These data are coming from the first 6 months of 2021. So first of all, let's see the calls received. As I said, averagely, you have that number of calls per day. This is the monthly amount of calls from Lombardy, but sometimes you receive calls also from nearby regions. As I said, since the structure is regional based, 116, 117 has to handle those particular calls in a different way, forwarding the, let's say, the process to neighboring regions. And this is the average per day that we described before. As you see, it doesn't really change very much in the first 6 months. Calls forwarded. So this also answers the question that was raised before. First of all, the classical call forwarding. So how many of these calls actually needed the intervention of a doctor after the first triage procedure from the call taker? From the graphic you see, let's say we are about 55–60% of those calls, which means the others were treated and managed without any particular intervention of a doctor. So probably they were just general information, where's the pharmacy, and so on. And here on the right, you can see the calls forwarded to ambulance. Just keep in mind, 116, 117 does not forward emergency calls to 112, because otherwise 112 would need to forward them again to ambulance. So there is a straight connection between 116, 117 and the ambulance dispatchers, as if they were 112. Of course, this, I mean, it's made easier because RAO manages everything. No? So separate, let's say, infrastructures, but they are talking to each other through the same management. And you may not see, actually, but it's a very small light red column here, which means less than 1% of the calls are actually becoming emergency once they land on 116, 117. This is another interesting graphic. It's the calls per weekday. As you may imagine, the majority of calls happen during the weekend, because that's when you don't have your family doctor available. Usually for non-emergency situations, you may refer to your family doctor. So at nighttime and weekends, 116, 117 is, of course, overloaded, if you want, with calls. And the response time. So the response time is around 100 seconds, more or less, a little bit more sometimes. There were periods in March in Saturday and Sunday, so weekends, that went very high. But again, we are not talking about emergency, so this is still acceptable. And the processing time is also interesting. So the procedure is made so that the processing time is limited, is very tight. Throughout the 6 months, there wasn't really a big change. I would say actually there was an improvement. No? So also operators start getting acquainted with the job. The processing time of a call taker, of course, is about the same time, so 150, less than 200 seconds. And finally, the call distribution. So let's say that the call distribution automatically, no? If you think about the region and what's in the region, Milan is the capital city, 33% of the calls are coming from the city. The rest of the calls are almost averagely distributed between the other provinces, which are quite small, and there are very small ones, like the mountain area, just a couple of percentage of calls. So what happened during, and then I will complete my presentation. What happened with COVID-19? Of course, since this was active since 2019, they had to go through a reform. As a matter of fact, we were in a period with daily reviews of the procedures for 112, ambulance, and 116, 117. And it was for them a challenge, and for us as well, because we had to follow, technically speaking, all the requests. But the picture here shows more or less what happened during COVID period. So you could either, as a citizen, so here, as a citizen, you could call 112, toll-free information number, which was created exactly for the purpose of getting COVID information, or 116, 117. Depending on which one you wanted to call, you had potential results. So if you called 112, you could have a non-COVID emergency, regular one. You could have a potential COVID emergency. So you landed on a specific COVID PSAP that was created for the purpose, ambulance PSAP. If you called the toll-free number, okay, that was just information. You could have been redirected to the toll-free number if the triage of the COVID situation said it wasn't an emergency, a COVID-related emergency. Finally, if you called 116, 117, the situation was you either go to the normal doctor information with non-COVID situation, or you could have been redirected to COVID emergency PSAP. This picture doesn't show what happens in all the other cases, in all the other emergency, police, fire, because it's really not relevant in a COVID situation. But finally, the way the citizen was able to get his information was treated in this way, or potentially rescued. So the statement of the region was that 116, 117 brought a revolution. Now people are getting more and more familiar with what's going on with this non-emergency number. I personally use it several times, and I think it's a very good service. And the region and then the state will follow up with the plans I've seen, I mentioned before, with much more structured answers to create a particular service and provide extra information, extra data to citizens, which is not just emergency. Thank you.
Thank you, Luca, for this presentation. Is there any question from the audience? Yes, one, third row.
Hello, it's Yves from Contracts Bulgaria. Luca, which is the public authority that is the owner of this number in Italy, in Lombardy, for example? And the same question to Björn in Sweden. Thank you.
So Areo is basically the officially it's the 112 contact center owner, ambulance PSAP dispatcher owner, and now they also own the 116, 117 service. In other regions, since, like I said, it's regional based, this may change. We know other regions that are simply following the Areo model, so the same 112 PSAP responsible, they are setting up the 116, 117 equivalent, but separated. So same authority, but different branches, if you want. So I would say, my opinion is most regions will follow the same. 112 will become also 116, 117 responsible.
In Sweden, see if I get, yeah, there. In Sweden, we have 21 independent regions, as I said, and they had formed a company actually to run the service 1177. So it's the regions jointly who run the services.
Thank you for the question and the answers. We have to move forward. If you have any more questions, that will be at the end of the session. It's time for Yves Stevens from the National Crisis Center in Belgium to tell us a nice story too. The floor is yours.
I hope so. Good morning. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Yves Stevens. I'm the spokesperson of the National Crisis Center in Belgium. The National Crisis Center is responsible to manage crises, major emergencies. And one of the main topics is, of course, crisis communication, to communicate during a crisis with the population. And therefore, we can use different kinds of communication channels, social media, media, press conferences, alerting systems. We have our own B-alert, but also a crisis hotline. And in the next few minutes, I will discuss with you this crisis hotline. So to be very clear, it's a non-emergency number. We can activate it during major emergencies, like, for example, the COVID crisis, the floods during last summer, but also the terrorist attacks. We can activate this special crisis hotline. The main objective of this crisis hotline is to inform the population, to go in dialogue with the population. If they have practical questions, if they have concerns or practical questions, for example, regarding to the COVID crisis, where I can get myself a test, that kind of practical question, it's clear it's a non-emergency call. Another important objective of this crisis hotline is to avoid saturation of the emergency numbers. During a crisis, for example, a terrorist attack, there are, of course, a lot of emergency calls. And we want that the lines of the emergency service are always open. So therefore, we activate this crisis number, so to avoid saturation. How does it work, this crisis hotline? A very important point is we have an agreement with a private company. A private company that's specialized in the field of call taking. For example, they are now maybe doing some call taking for private companies, for example, air company. So it's a private company. They provide, of course, the staff members, the infrastructures, etc., etc. So the private company is day and night disponible, so we can contact them day and night. That's in the agreement that we have with the private company. Another agreement is that they must be operational within 1 hour, with at least 4 call takers. But in our experience, they are way faster because they are also very proactive. If there is an emergency, they go in a kind of standby. So they are, most of the time, they are just waiting for information of our information. So it's operational in 1 hour or maybe 14 minutes. Another important point is for local emergencies, for example, fire in a chemical plant, it's located in one municipality of one city. Local authorities can also activate the crisis hotline, but it's a local hotline. The crisis center will not communicate the number, but it's up to the local authorities to communicate to their population the crisis hotline. It's also to avoid saturation of the crisis number, of the emergency numbers, and also to provide some practical information to the local population. Other practical aspects of this crisis hotline, we have agreement with the Red Cross, because we all know that during emergencies, people need sometimes psychosocial support, and they will give a call to the crisis hotline. So therefore, if the call taker of the private company has someone on the line who needs support, he will transfer the line to a colleague of the Red Cross. So the staff members of the Red Cross are specialized in this kind of call taking. So it's not the private company, it's our staff members of the Red Cross. Another important thing for us in Belgium is that the private company is able to deal phone calls in 4 languages. Brussels is a very international city, so English, French, Dutch, and also German. The call takers are able to manage those calls. Another important thing is that there is also an agreement and collaboration with sign language interpreters. So also deaf people can call to this crisis hotline. It's a special set up with a Zoom call, but most important is that the private company has all the infrastructure to deal with those phone calls. Okay, a few data. This was a terrorist attack in Brussels at 2016. We immediately activated the crisis hotline after the first attack. There were 2 attacks, one at the airport, one at the subway. The hotline was almost operational for 1 month. But of course, what you see is a high peak the first 2 days. With a lot of practical questions. For example, where can I pick up my luggage? My luggage is at the airport, I want to pick up my luggage. Or what about the flights for the next day? Or what about the flights for next week? Or where can I pick up my, my car? It's also at the airport, etc., etc. A lot of practical questions. What you see, the red line, are the phone calls with psychosocial support, but also people who are looking or searching for family and friends. And this kind of calls were not managed by the private company, but also by staff members of the Red Cross. Okay. This is some figures from the COVID crisis. We started the number in the end of January. What you see, of course, is a high peak in March, at the beginning of the first lockdown, totally lockdown. And you see also a peak at June and July. There were all questions about traveling. It was a tourism high season, and a lot of citizens had some questions about, can I travel to France, to Italy, etc., etc. So a lot of practical questions, non-emergency calls, of course. What can I further tell? So, the COVID hotline crisis is still operational. For this moment, 2,500 calls a day. With, for this moment, a lot of questions regarding to the vaccination, of course. In the first few weeks, the crisis hotline was operational day and night. But we step by step, we adapted the opening hours. Very careful, because we knew if we adapt, because every adaptation of the opening hours has an effect on the amount of numbers by the emergency services. So we are in close contact, and if we notice for example, during the weekends, that there is a high number of non-emergency calls at 112, we adapt our opening hours. So it's looking for a balance with our colleagues from 112. Of course, the peak, almost 10,000 calls on beginning of the lockdown. A lot of practical, very, very practical questions. Can I go to the shop? Can I go, am I allowed to take my bike, etc., etc. A lot of very practical questions. Number of call takers, yeah, from 10 to more than 100. And that's the big advantage that we work with a private company. We can upscale very quickly. We have daily contact with the private company. We got a list, a kind of top 10 of the most posed questions. That's very useful for us, for our communications. If there is a question, we will, for example, we will provide the answer also in, for example, press conferences or in social media. But the daily calls are very useful to also to adapt the number of operators. Furthermore, the conclusions. I think working with a private company has multiple advantages. you don't have to provide staff members, you don't have to provide infrastructure, formations, etc., etc. They are still on standby. Of course, we pay a standby cost, and we pay if we activate the hours, the hours of the call takers. And for the municipalities, they only pay if they activate the call center. So the standby cost is a national cost. It's for the National Crisis Center. So for the municipalities, it's for free, unless they activate, and then they will pay the hours of the call takers. Yeah, practical questions. Listen to the questions, listen to the concerns of the population. Avoid saturation of the emergency numbers. I think that's a very important objective. Yeah, dialogue with the citizen, listen to the questions, listen to the concerns, and use this information. This information is very useful to use in other communication channels. For example, press conferences. In the first weeks, we organized daily a press conference, but therefore we used also the top 10 of the most posed questions. That are the questions, that are the concerns of the population, so we can provide information by the crisis hotline, but also with additional communication channels, for example, press conference of social media, etc. So I think these are the most important conclusions. If there are any questions.
Thank you, Yves, for this excellent presentation. I think there are a couple of questions because it's quite of an original, I mean, first time I hear something like that, an original model. So, yeah.
I got a small question about the activeness of the number. How fast can you activate the number? Because it's on a standby, you said, yes? And you can activate it. How fast it goes?
It's standby, day and night. So we have a special number, and the crisis center can activate it. We have an agreement with the company, and they must be active in 1 hour after the first phone call. But in reality, they are most of the time faster. Especially during the day, it's 40 minutes. And most of the time, they have to wait for our, we have to work on a frequently asked question list, and that takes more time than be operational with all the call takers.
Thank you.
This is a question for all the panelists. A lot of the people calling your non-emergency numbers will give you personal information. Do you use the same systems as your 112 call centers to secure that personal information, to authenticate, etc., to ensure that you're compliant with GDPR?
So we'll start with Yves to answer this question.
It's not the same system than the 112, but of course we have an agreement regarding privacy with the private company. But I don't know exactly all the protocols, but it's not the same system as the 112.
Luca?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same answer. So technology might be the same or very similar. Responsibility might be from the same authority, but they manage it in a different way. So they have to be compatible with the GDPR. Let's say, each agency or discipline on its own matters. They have to independently secure the data. Of course, in cases like ours, where the same agency manages 112 ambulance and 116, 117, that makes things easier because they already did it for the rest.
Björn?
It differs from number to number. So on the 11313 general information number, we don't register any personal information. On the medical number, it's the same that the regions use, journal systems. And for the police, I mean, it's if you are just calling to the switchboard, there will be no personal registration. If you want to file a police report, it's the standard police system. So.
I can add an information from Switzerland. If you call the non-emergency medical number, it will be the same than 112. They will get your name. But if it's an emergency number, crisis number, or if you want to know if your luggage is at the airport, we will not do that because it takes too much time. Any more questions from the audience? If not, I will close this session. Thank you for coming. I hope you will all be convinced that we all need non-emergency numbers, so that's my opinion, because it will reduce the burden on your emergency number 112. Now it's time for a coffee break, and we will start again at 11:30.